Peter's original idea. Why don't we do something called prosperity Marxism? We've always talked about, nothing is too good for the representatives of the working class, and what would that too good be, right? And anyway, in that light, I brought chocolates, dark chocolates for everybody. Apropos Leonard Cohen, everybody wants a bunch of chocolates and some long stem roses. Couldn't find the good roses, and they were not fresh, but at least the chocolates are here. Anyway, we're going to engage, this concept, prosperity Marxism, what it means. I don't think we really know yet, but there is, a kind of tradition behind this. It's in Marx and in other thinkers. I'm going to set this up first on, giving a kind of critique of tendencies in Marxism, in a very sketchy way, and then I would like to go on to the work of somewhat of George Bataille. I would like to look at a letter that Alexander Kojève wrote on post-World War II, and the lack of agency and the impossibility of agency, which was a very pessimistic moment, and then how Bataille responded to that and his notion of expenditure. And I recommend, in this light, this is in 3 volumes. This is the first volume, The Accursed Share. And this ends with the Marshall Plan, and then he goes back to earlier stuff. And, Bataille has been thought of as a traitor, an anti-Marxist, all of which I would take issue with, but I think he's important in this notion of prosperity, Marxism, as we go forward. Anyway, another thing I just wanted to mention, the 3 of us, and with another colleague, Bruno Gulli, are working on a text called Techniques of Servitude, where hopefully some of these ideas come out. We've been very, very interested in doing a book project on this notion of how do people end up desiring their slavery or their servitude rather than their freedom, and what that means. And we started this project in a class based on Frederick Orwell's book, The Willing Slaves of Capital. How people become willing slaves to the system, and what does that mean? And we read everybody from The Right to Be Lazy, to economic problem of masochism and Freud, as well as many other texts. And Lobachier's classic, The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, which kind of started everything. And to me, this is really the premier ethical question of as a philosopher. How does this occur? How do people end up making these choices? How does a working class group of people, or Rust Belt or whatever, end up voting for Donald Trump, right? How is this conditioned into this? Not that the alternative was any much better. Maybe, we don't know. Maybe they're worse, we really don't know. But anyway, all to say, we're working on this project, and my introduction will be called An Archaeology of Failure, and I was just going to sketch out a couple of things that I've been working on for a while in very, very outline form. Marxism seems, and earlier today I heard our friend Panagiotis Sotiris, who's here as a participant and presenter in another venue earlier today, talk about, the left has been pretty much in disarray since, May of '68, post-May of '68 has created all kinds of reactions, but also within Marxism. So it seems to me that there are 3 levels, rescue operations, that are always a tendency in Marxism. And, maybe this is one of the, predicates, if you will, for our reason to come up with the concept of prosperity Marxism. The first I call dogmatic re-entrenchment or entrenchment, dogmatic entrenchment. So every external position and all opposition is defined in dogmatic discursive fashion, right? All doubts from the outside and the inside can be overcome. And we see this, in texts such as Sartre certainly anticipates this in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he distinguishes between dogmatic dialectic and the critical dialectic. And this, to me, produces a kind of left hubris. Marx is all right, always. Our Marxism is all right. And we see this tendency mostly in the economistic left, operative all the time, this left hubris. But a lot of other things where the categories remain the same. You know, the categories are always the same. It's the same group of panels, the same kind of questions being asked, right? The same kind of responses being set up. So I see this as a part of a real tendency on the left that needs to be overcome, you know, both critiqued within and overcome. The second path is a little smoother. It's the anti-dogmatic evaporation, I call it, right? Where Marxism is reduced to a general ethic, and it highlights things such as corruption, of which my friend Peter is an expert on, political corruption and, you know, economic corruption. It takes concept for use in everyday life, where it explains the daily horror shows in very simplistic and populist terms, right? And one of the counter tendencies to this was always, and this is part of I think, a very vulgar humanistic Marx, of which Althusser and his anti-humanism, you know, really was against this soft tendency within Marxism. And a lot of people criticize Althusser for this anti-humanist moment, but you know, again, part of this anti-humanist moment was against this soft tendency, I think, you know, and should be used to, you know, engage with it in a sense. Okay, the third path is what we're witnessing today, I think, from everything, and I'm not trying to be reductionistic here, but I think it's thinking in terms of broad categories, the high and great expectations tendency, right? So you have this unswerving, you know, or unswerving activists and Adventists. We're always at the beginning again. You know, look at the yellow vest. Look at the, you know, DSA movement in the United States, right? That never can be disappointed, you know, if something has come up again. Never really disappointed or critical, because they are, they avoid every rose. They're unable to see the situation for what it is. You know, this is always a problem. This is a strategy of avoidance from my perspective on the left. And that's using the Hegelian language, here's roads, dance here. They don't really dance, right? Because they would have to dance, right? In a way, as everybody knows the Emma Goldman slogan, don't come to the revolution if you can't dance. So this is another thing. So this is a Marxism that, to me, kind of borders along the line of a quasi-religious moment, right? That somehow this new advent, this new beginning is there, and we see signs of it all the time. You know, and I'm not saying that we should, you know, go after this in a way, but it seems to be part of these rescue operations, right? In a sense, I think we should always be critical on dogmatic entrenchment. I think this is something we need to do. Anti-dogmatic evaporation is another, you know, real moment. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're really getting into this moment. So anyway, again, out of these rescue operations, I think what we're trying to do, and this is, of course, a very, very early work in progress, this prosperity Marxism, in a sense. You know, we want to think about how is wealth being generated and how can we generate wealth in the future instead of the classic poverty studies. You don't like what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. You're going to put it all right. You missed it all. Anyway.
The general flourish.
The general flourish, right? Right. So anyway, Marx of course, writes the rich human being is simultaneously the human being in need of a totality of human manifestations of life. Again, Marxism as a project of life, transformative life, as, you know, the dream of the whole person that we saw as a one level, you know, of course, the total man, the new man in the Che Guevara, you know, Cuban revolutionary sense, right? All roundness of total individuals that he speaks of in the German ideology. You notice, anti-Althusser, and I go back to some of the humanistic writings from the German ideology, and that's, you know, part of the break. The Manifesto of 1848, the image of an association in which the full development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Again. And so in some ways, one slogan we could take from the past, instead of all power to the Soviets, you know, and electricity without the, you know, plus the Soviets. So first the electricity, then the Soviets. When everybody's always talking about the question of organization, maybe what we really need to start talking about is where's the impulse, where's the electricity, you know, to get going. This is just some thoughts, again, very, very raw and going forward. So anyway, going back to some of the dogmatic tendencies, the scientific establishment of surplus value is again, I think, missing the point as part of the entrenchment. It becomes part of the new economism, as is the question, and Peter gave a great paper that I heard in Greece on Homo economicus. We really need to transgress this moment of economic math, because this is all that so many people talk about at this point. And really this whole thing of the 1% versus the 99%, it's a good slogan, but ultimately does it really get to the point of what we're really trying to do in terms of prosperity, for lack of a better term. And I think of prosperity, by the way, one association that came up when Peter brought this out is Prospero's books in The Tempest. Right? The magic, right, that is performed in some way, the master both of the fetish, right, but also is very much in touch with the European sensibility of scientific progress and rationality. So this mixture of the magic, again, losing the electricity and the magic is another thing. And I'm not, you know, saying that we should become alchemists, but, you know, maybe in certain cases, when it's all else is failed, maybe that's something, you know. There's a phrase out there called acid communism. I don't know if you've heard of this. Has anyone heard of acid communism? This is Mark Fisher.
What kind of acid?
Well, there's all kinds of different topics. Right, that's the best question out here, right? Anyway, yeah. It's not acidine communism, but it could be corrosive. Yeah. So anyway, but we can go back around to that, but that's a phrase out there. He's written a lot of books on, you know, there's no alternative. He passed away early, which was very, very sad, but he was part of the you know, some of the people associated with the journal Salvage and others. So yeah, acid communism, if you want to look it up, and this is a new form, you know, of communism for the generation, if you will, of the 90s, those born under, you know, the TV syndrome, if you will. I mean, I was lucky I didn't have to be born under that sign of Tina, right? And then some, you know, my colleagues are born under that, you know, or at least emerged during that period, right? In many ways. So anyway, to go back, you know, the question of labor has been lost, you know, this prosperity, the labor question, and as an organizing and reorganizing practice, you know, because in science, scientific discourse never really talks about labor, right? This is it, you know, we have this dominant technocratic scientific complex that never really talks about the labor involved, and this is something we have to, I think, also return to, right? And then the whole thing of necessity and the societies of abundance, you know, that you know, the less of necessity, more of abundance. This is another thing we're going to, you know, hopefully engage today in different ways. So anyway, I want to make a move here. These are kind of very, again, broad outlines. I want to move to Bataille, which I think it's important to reread him. I mean, whether you like his poetry, his poetics, his novelistic tendency. As some of you know, Susan Sontag called him the gentleman pornographer in his novels. This was a French student of Alexander Kojève's in the 1930s, who was the ended up being the general director of the Bibliothèque Nationale, was his day job, you know, for many years after, and was a writer of rank and very well known, etc. Primarily his work was from the 30s until the 60s. He was kicked out of the Surrealist movement for being too surrealist, pushing it to the extremes, kicked out by André Breton, who went to it. And anyway, I think that he is one way of going back to this prosperity Marxism, where he does talk about the societies of abundance, the societies of we have so much, you know. And again, this work is situated, it ends with 1947, the Marshall Plan, and of course the emergent Truman Doctrine the next year. But in some ways, it starts to open up a question no longer of scarcity, right? That scarcity is something we don't really need to presuppose our thinking on. So the amazing thing to me about Bataille, for me in Bataille, is that I reread some of his philosophical stuff. The most interesting thing to me is that he sets up what he calls the science of the impossible. It's no longer the conditions of the possible, but it is the science of the impossible, and something that we can also talk to. It was always the paradox, if you will, in Bataille, running of revolt and fatalism. You know, how can we think through what Panagiotis earlier today inverted the great Gramscian saying, or Roman saying, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, into optimism of the intelligence or the intellect and a pessimism of the will. You know, that maybe how do we work with this pessimism of the will, the kind of fatalism that turns into cynicism, or we've heard that before, etc. And the interesting thing again about Bataille to me, and this takes a lot of hard work, is he was always unsympathetic and unwilling to submit to a recuperative dialectic or a reconciliation in the dialectic. Very anti-Hegelian teleological or Hegelian Marxist teleological in this way. So it never could be recouped nor reconciled for him. And in this process, then the possibility of reduplication of images, right? One did not go to back to the past and say, oh, Rosa Luxemburg thought this, you know, etc. These kind of images of the past no longer had the same validity, right? Because you were still trapped within this recuperative dialectic. So this is a very interesting moment. I think this works also in the artwork. Where is the breakthrough, or to use some language that I think should replace revolution, rupture? Where is the rupture possible? Where is that space? You know, if you think of a totality as a space or process where any possibility could be unfolded, how do you rupture within that totality, right, into a new science of the possible? And these are just some, you know, again, elementary propositions to be thought through. So anyway, so Bataille's working during what we, you know, since 1991, maybe 89, better put, we've lived through two basic tendencies in the West. One is, of course, the Huntington thesis that the world is the clash of civilizations, right, on the one hand, and then, of course, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the building of the PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, which is now morphed into much worse than what Bush and company had imagined, and the, you know, this kind of minor group of Strauss students at the University of Chicago. So within these two tendencies, the end of history and the clash of civilizations has pretty much set up this kind of triumphalism and Tina syndrome. So again, you know, how do we think our ways out of it? So I'm going to read you something that Kojève said, and I don't know if everybody, Alexander Kojève was a Russian immigrant in Paris in the 1920s, and he gave 6 years of lectures on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit to a group of people, which was a who's who of French intelligentsia: Merleau-Ponty, Jacques Lacan, Simone de Beauvoir, Paul Lévi-Strauss, etc., all attended his lecture. Raymond Queneau, George Bataille was his assistant during this period. After the war, he was also a Stalinist operative. He was a member of the party. He was, you know, very interested in terms of the code. His reading of Hegel was really Marx, right, which was interesting. You know, you had to decode, you know, if you knew what was going on, you know, it wasn't really Hegel. And he wrote a beautiful thing, if you've ever looked at the American version, which is truncated, in place of an introduction. And it's really about, you know, proletarian revolution. He references the lectures this way. But anyway, he wrote a letter to Van der Pel, the Vietnamese intellectual who was also in Paris during that period, in 1948. And after the war, Kojève had become de Gaulle's Minister of the Economy. And it's interesting, he went the way of Gaullism after the war, kind of gave up. He discovered some letters he wrote to Stalin, you know, and you know, it's interesting, you know, he actually read Bataille's work, and it's interesting how he constitutes this. He wrote to Trans-individuation, there will be no post-World War period. Rather, after there will be nothing, or yet even more so, what will be is unthinkable. After such a war, there will be no afterwards, right? And this is what, you know, Bataille is sort of engaging. So for Bataille, the switch in a certain way is to what I kind of think is part of maybe at least my end of the prosperity Marxism to go forward, and we can discuss this, is a kind of Nietzschean Marxism, Marxism, in a way, where revolt is really then becomes almost metaphysical, the superhuman, right? You know, in a certain way. For Kojève, this was doomed to failure, but I kept this going for a long time. And for Kojève, and for those of you that are students of philosophy, remember this about Hegel, and this is why it's worth studying. He becomes the evidence, right, for this kind of moment that the objective world spirit reaches a certain point, right, etc., and that we do mark a kind of end of history, which is in the emperors coming to Napoleon in Jena in 1807. And we haven't gone so far away from Bonapartism. I mean, to think of this where we are today. We get closer every day. I mean, Trumpism, it's a degradation of Bonapartism. You know, we're seeing that at work. So anyway, we're gonna talk about this. I'm gonna let Peter go next, because Bataille has, I'm sure you're going to talk a little bit about this, the expenditure, right? You know, really about what is the expenditure of energy, what is this surplus, what becomes ultimately the excess, right, that leads to prosperity. How can we reconstitute this and do this? So anyway, I think I'll stop there since I've gone, you know, almost 25 minutes. So, yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, I have to say that the term originally I coined in reaction to the prosperity gospel. As you may know, there are the new Christian, well, one of the new Christian hooks is that they will help you become affluent. So you send in your check, $49.95, whatever, and they will,
we need more.
They will help you decode the Bible in a way to show you the road to financial prosperity. So I said, what kind of bullshit is this? Right. We can do much better.
This goes towards revolution of your life, right?
Yeah. So the idea
we're way past Jesus on the main line.
We would do a traveling roadshow throughout, you know, Topeka, Kansas, you know, these places, and you know, we would have Stanley or Arnowitz, right, Stanley with a good reason, say, you know, if you read the fragment.
690 to 720.
Yeah, and it would be a much more honest, a much more believable, certainly, idea that if you can read Marx properly, you can unlock the secrets of capitalism, you know, the road to prosperity. But then the rest of the group was not keen on packing up a van and going to Topeka, Kansas. So the term then mutated in a way, prosperity Marxism, because of the reaction by many people, which was one of suspicion and disagreement. Because there is, unfortunately, I believe, a heavy moralistic overflow from Christianity and liberalism into Marxism many times. And there is an idea that, well, to be a Marxist is to be, to live in a very non-wasteful way, in a sense, you know, to live very, not to live extravagant, not to be extravagant, to be humble and poor, as if one were a monk or a priest. Now, this is, of course, a Christian, you know, the inverse of the Christian, from prosperity to the previous, which was to live in the simple way. Yeah. So obviously it highlighted a fundamental division in Marxism. What is the purpose of the class struggle? What is the goal? what is the proper way to be, let's say, true to Marxist values in everyday life, to use that term. And it harkens back to people like Paul, I mean, not only Marx himself, but people like Paul Lafargue and others. As you may know, Lafargue's most famous work is The Right to be Lazy, in his chastising of the labor movement for demanding the right to work, rather than demanding the right not to work, right? To be liberated in that sense, rather than to demand one's further enslavement to the labor market and work as such. And of course, we're back. We never went beyond that question, and we're back now. Of course, even many people like Javier Cortez and Bernie Sanders and others want to have a kind of public works projects of giving people jobs to do all kinds of things that will just add to the problem of surplus, potentially.
Jobs in the book of Job.
Yeah. So
Suffer, keep suffering, and believe.
So this is one part of the question of what is prosperity Marxism referring to, what is the agenda. At the same time, it is referring to, or trying to highlight, a fundamental problem of capitalism, which is that even though capitalism on the one hand promises the liberation of people from, we live in a situation where we have all these time-saving conveniences. Subways, dishwashers, microwave ovens, whatever, one after the other, and yet people live in ever greater degrees of scarcity and misery. I mean, I recall Picasso used to use the guitars. Right. Picasso has a very nice line saying, I want to become wealthy so I can live like a peasant. I want to be able to live like a peasant, meaning what? To be able to sleep when you want to sleep, to wake up when you want to wake up, and which these days, you have to be two things, very wealthy and a communist together, which is not...
Like Picasso.
Yeah, like Picasso, which is not the norm. The norm is, and our compatriot Arianna Huffington, who is from the other side of the bathroom.
Different village.
She's from she's from the bourgeois outskirts. Her whole thing now is how to sleep, right? In a sense, to sleep 8 hours today becomes a great luxury.
Enjoy the appliances.
Well, you have to invest in a very, in a proper mattress, and is the great luxury of being able to sleep for 8 hours a night. How important that is to one's productivity and healthiness and so forth. And this is now, we have gotten to a point where one might aspire to being able to sleep 8 hours a night. It's a great aspiration, and there's a whole industry now, of course, and this is really highlighting some of the perversion of contemporary capitalism. That together with all of this productivity, you have ever increasing amounts of misery and miseration. People are constantly sick, constantly malnourished in various ways, and so on down the line. And the paradox is, this is where it goes back to this question of techniques of servitude and otherwise. Nonetheless, people are ever more attached to the values, the libidinal economy of capitalism in the marketplace than ever before. Hand in hand with the great misery that it produces, they are more and more attached. I started teaching in the mid-90s, and in some of my classes, I assigned, not the tie, but the Lafargue, The Right to be Lazy. And increasingly, the last few years especially, the students are ever more antagonistic to the arguments. They used to be, it was funny and it was interesting, and now they get very angry in reading the Lafargue, as if because they see the challenge to their own I get the same reaction when I teach Althusser to the people who study education, the prospective teachers.
I'm going to pay my students that.
Well, not only that, because they tell themselves, they live in the idea that, well, if you're a teacher, you're not going to make a lot of money, but you're doing something good for the kids. You know, it is a noble profession. And then when you read the Althusser saying the schools are ideological state apparatuses, you're working on behalf of the state, it shatters that fantasy. They get very angry. You know, they get very angry. Now they have to say, well, we'll do it for the summer vacation and the dental plan. So, yeah. So that's one of the real paradoxes of contemporary capitalism, that people have ever decreasing amounts of time, ever decreasing amounts of, you know, even to cook becomes a luxury. Now there are all kinds of systems on how you can save yourself the trouble of going to the supermarket. They'll deliver the food to you. Everything is pre-measured, pre-packaged, you know, simple directions, and in 30 minutes you can have a home-cooked meal, as it were. So even the idea of you go to the supermarket, you go to the marketplace, let alone, as in the good old days, you go to the butcher and the baker and so forth, become completely unthinkable in many cases. So that's part of it. The other part of another part of the dilemma is the lack of extravagance, especially on behalf of the bourgeoisie. You know, I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we talk about a good dinner, let's say, or reading books, as some people do, or as bourgeois, you know, as bourgeois activities. Oh, that's very bourgeois, you know. You want to have the nice wines and good and so forth. The bourgeoisie is that's not the bourgeois value, I'm sorry to tell you. That's a working class. That is, in the sense, a proletarian, you know,
aspiration.
Tendency, right? Because for us to go out and buy nice fish is a lot more money than for Donald Trump, let's say, but Donald Trump prefers Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's to these kinds of things. So it is not the case that to pursue matters of the intellect, of the arts, to live well, to have free time, is a value that the bourgeoisie values. No, the bourgeoisie is like, who's the one in Kansas? The big investment fund.
Warren Buffett.
Yeah,
Nebraska. We were precise. You know, we were trying to
people
take
like
this
Warren,
down.
people like Warren Buffett, Omaha, Nebraska, who are relatively speaking frugal, live in a simple house, drink Coca-Cola, have the hamburger during the day, and this creates a real serious problem in capitalism. The problem of capitalism is not that the bourgeoisie is extravagant. I wish they would buy yachts and, you know, many nice things and spend the money. They don't do that. They accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And this is, really, this brings us back to George Bataille, because George Bataille's argument is that we don't live in a world of scarcity, as the liberal theory asserts. We live in a world of too much. So look at the sun and how much energy it provides to us. What does it mean too much? To use the energy of the sun gives us well, you have to be wasteful. If you're not wasteful, it becomes problematic. You cannot, for example, what is the problem of global warming? Global warming is we absorb too much energy from the sun. We are too efficient. To do it properly, you have to be extremely inefficient. You see what I'm saying? Inefficient. Yes. Why do people use fossil fuels? Well, it's much cheaper, much more efficient in that sense. To use other forms of energy is more time-consuming, more expensive, is more wasteful. Yes, but that might be a much more realistic way of doing things. You see? So you have to be wasteful. If you're not wasteful, and then he goes through, if those who haven't read the book, he gives different examples of how different cultures dealt with this problem of what he calls the accursed share, that surplus that accumulates. And you have to find a way of getting rid of it. if you don't find a way of getting rid of it, it'll come crashing down upon you. There will be another war, there will be another form of great destruction that will do the work for you. So better you come up with a way to get rid of it before it accumulates so high that it comes crashing down. And he gives some examples, one being, of course, the system of potlatch in the Pacific Northwest among the various tribes there, which is what? Which is that you gain political power or you gain prestige, social prestige, by giving away things. It's a gift economy. The more you give away, the higher your status becomes. So it's a culture of constantly giving things away, and that is politically how, you know, you have the Aztecs. How do they do it? Human sacrifice. So look at what the Aztecs have war, not for the purpose of gaining more territory, more land, but for the purpose of getting people to sacrifice. And then when they do the sacrifices, you know, every year they pick one person of their own to sacrifice. It is a year where they extravagantly spend on that person. All kinds of great wines and foods and all the luxuries of the world, and then at the end you get killed.
And they become hummingbirds as a reward.
Well, yes. But you see that, you know, the great extravagance.
Of the orgiastic.
We can talk about it in the discussion. So there has to be a wastefulness. And in that sense, because I think the title of the thing was proletarian extravagance, in that sense, the working class, I think by instinct, is much more extravagant. It's the working classes that will spend more than they have, will go into debt for living well, let's say, or the desire to live well, as opposed to the bourgeoisie, which is really a miserable, is a culture of misery. And unnecessary frugality, in that sense. Unnecessary frugality. Why would, if you were a billionaire, why make more money? What can you do with 5 billion that you couldn't do with 2 billion? Or 1 billion? Or half a billion for that matter? Why continue to work in these things? And I'm reminded of our friend Bill DeFazio and his book on the longshoremen, which one of the interesting points he made there, one of the interesting findings was that, as you may know, Brooklyn before it was, the waterfront of Brooklyn before it was condominiums and cafes,
And container runs.
yeah, was a port, major port, you know, in the East Coast, and they switched to containerized shipping in the 70s, which is to say, instead of, like, you know, on the waterfront, you know, people unloading the ship with forklifts and, you know, hauling the crates and so forth. Now everything, as you know, is containerized shipping. The ship comes in, everything's in containers. The crane takes the container off the ship, puts it on the truck drives away. Much less labor intensive. Which is, from our standpoint, a great improvement. The less people have to work, the better. The union agreed to this switch under the conditions that the people then who were employed as longshoremen there, working for the ports, would be given pensions. So you had people in their 40s, for example, being given full pensions as part of this deal. So one of the questions was, what will these people do? Most people thought, well, they will get another job, and they will have 2 good incomes. They'll have their full pension from the union as part of this deal, and they'll get a job doing something else, and they'll make a lot of money. But Bill found that that was not the case by and large, that most people took the pension, and then they dedicated the rest of their lives to something beyond working. So that is, I think, gives a very good indication of that. Because a lot of people on the left also, unfortunately, have this kind of workerish attitude that people who work is a good thing, it's better, you know, you people don't work, but to work is a good thing. The working class doesn't think like that. The working class wants to get the hell out of having to work. You know, they don't glorify work at all. They know that, you know, the only people who do it, people who never had experience of doing this kind of work. So I think this is what we have to really emphasize. The limitations of capitalism how capitalism really creates ever greater amounts of austerity and misery while accumulating these huge amounts of wealth that there's only one way that's going to lead us. So it's, in the long run, extremely destructive for everyone, including the people accumulating the wealth, because there will be a catastrophe through that ever-increasing wealth. And at the same time, we have to make a better argument. That's one of the paradoxes. How can capitalism still capture the desires and the sensibilities of the working classes when all that provides them is more work, more misery, more debt? They dream of being able to sleep 8 hours a day or to have, the life of a peasant 200, 300, 400 years ago. They aspire to that, like our friend Picasso. So I think this is our challenge.
Good. So I'm just going to read, what Peter was mentioning from Bataille. Bataille says, and this is on page 21 of the Accursed Chair, The Meaning of General Economy, which was his answer to Marx to put this into terms of expenditure, surplus, and actually the excess of energy. The living organism in a situation determined by the play of energy on the surface of the globe ordinarily receives more energy than is necessary for maintaining life. The excess energy, wealth, can be used for the growth of a system, that is, for example, of an organism, if the system can no longer grow, however, or if the excess cannot be completely absorbed in its growth, it must necessarily be lost without profit, right? Willingly or not, gloriously or catastrophically. So this proposition that he begins this book on is I think, a very good starting point to think through, this term prosperity, Marxism, in many ways on the excess.
And we still reserve the right to go selling Marx as a way of getting wealth.
No, I was thinking when you said people don't cook, they have prepared food, we need to have a business, chefs on demand, that we'll go to the house and cook. Right? I know they do. Yeah, but we can do it better, chefs on demand. Okay.
People so at leisure.
I'm going to turn it over to Arto. I want to say that Arto, in a way, is going to talk about his concept of homo datum, which I think was an outgrowth of a seminar we did, somewhat on the work of Bernard Stiegler and other things, right?
Yeah,
somewhat,
and
other seminars over the years, and the Institute for Radical Imagination. And again, I tell people you can come up and get chocolates again. We're starting the prosperity with dark chocolate here.
I hope they have no nutritional value.
I knew you were going to bring up the catastrophic. Catastrophe. I know there's a literature person.
If they had nutritional value, the time would be upset.
Okay. Yeah. He would be.
As long as they're wasteful.
That's other kind of value. Yeah, but anyway, we won't go there at this part of the session. We'll go there. But anyway, he's going to do I think he has a very, very interesting project going on. This is a long project of his on what he considers, instead of homo economicus, we have turned into homo datum. No, right, so this is an interesting, moment, yeah.
So briefly, I think this project will make sense maybe in 20 years, once I figure out what I'm trying to say. So this is kind of like a first attempt to make sense of some of the things that I think are familiar to all of us, but in sort of trying to make sense of the fact that we are, in my sense at least, in a period of transition, right? So as we know, human societies, but especially capitalism, all that is solid melts into thin air, was the phrase from Marx. Unlike perhaps other forms of social organization, is constantly subject to change, right? And it's part of its dynamism and staying power. So this project sort of started with, but I want to say in response to Peter's great presentation, which is very polemical and necessarily so against liberal dogma. Lenin always said that the point of the revolution was to basically abolish the working class, because it was a condition of misery, of unnecessary misery, stunted, crippled human beings for no reason other than they're just being used as a means to an end. And that's really the point that it seems like Marxist revolutionary politics always was about, if it really was honest and knew what it was sort of doing. And I think maybe this is a good way to start this little outline. In that sense, it's kind of interesting that one way to defend Marxism or Marxist revolutionary politics is to defend it through the concept of the European Enlightenment, which is kind of a weird thing to say, because sometimes when some of our friends who are more sort of, like Michael said, dogmatic Marxists, sort of comfortable Marxists with their truths and their ideas, they differentiate Marx and revolutionary kind of politics from some of the other ideas of the European Enlightenment as sort of unnecessary or idealistic or wrong or whatnot. But I want to say that I was thinking about sort of this period of transition that we're going through, and I use the word data on purpose because, you know, sort of a double meaning, because, you know, data is sort of like the ubiquitous term of today, you know, big data, everything is data, the conversion of data. And I was like, you know what, maybe the capitalists, maybe they do mean it literally. Maybe they actually use the words properly, which of course they do. You know, there's a reason why I think, maybe even consciously, that the word data has become so widespread, beyond the fact that it's describing the dominant form of technological sort of form of technology today, which is digital technology. But data, of course, if we use the etymology, is the plural form of data, and data, of course, refers to an unchanging state, unchangeable state, a formed object, you know, like an entry in a database, like a blockchain. You know, the blockchain, which is a write-only database, an entry is made and it can never be erased without destroying the database itself. So that's a good metaphor of how what data means on the level of computer science, but on the level of politics, it's something horrific because it implies a political subjectivity that can never change. It's sort of a permanent condition of servitude. You know, if you live in a society organized along the principles of data, you know, that's like the worst thing you can imagine. And maybe that's what they're preparing, you know, in a certain sense, like the real politics of racism, you know, improved humans versus the unimproved humans. That's real racism, real formation of actual human races that are differentiable on the level of DNA and so on and so forth. So, but that's like a possible application that we might be moving towards if we don't get them first. But so I just want to review basically just in 5 minutes the starting point, I think, for in my view, is the need to recapture the primacy of the political. Like, if we were trying to fight for social change, in other words, we have to think politically rather than economically. And one of the first things I think that defines our time is that the political, as one of my friends said, we are in university, philosopher Diallo, he said, the political is isomorphic with the economic. The political functions according to the internal logic of the capitalist economic structures. That's not a normal thing. Right? Because we know since Aristotle, if we take Aristotle seriously, and you can't not take Aristotle seriously because those ideas have informed everything, at least in Western thinking, which is dominant today in the world, in the form of liberalism in a certain kind of more detached way. Aristotle said that human life has many compartments to it, and all of them have to function well in order for the human being and society as such to reach a state of optimal functioning, of healthy function. Fully developed human beings is sort of the goal of not a perverted political system, but a sort of political system the way it functions according to its nature. So human beings, Aristotle said, have different parts. If I want, like, oversimplify Aristotle's phrasing, we have different aspects to ourselves, different identities, as some people say today, but of course they mean it in a different way. Like, you know, it's important for us to be friends to someone. It's important for us to be loved by others and to love. That's no less important than going to work and engaging in the process of labor, which is only one aspect of what it means to be a human being that's functioning not in a sick way, but in a healthy way. And overarching all of that stuff is, of course, the political, which over-determines where these things happen on the level of the social, which is how we experience life, because we cannot live as individuals. It's impossible. We cannot be self-sufficient. So these are basic fundamental truths that are absolutely true, and they're easily verifiable. Because if you look at what happens to a human being who is left in a position of self-sufficiency, that's called essentially imprisonment. That's one example of taking a human being from the social and reducing them to the singular. Right? Which, by the way, is where Hegel begins his logic also, with the triads, the singular, the particular, and the universal. And the interplay of these logical categories are essentially rewriting of Aristotle's logic, which essentially was accepted as truth for 1,500 years. So the political we need to recapture the political and understand it again in our time as sort of the primary battleground against capitalism. And by doing that, you're basically saying we don't give a shit about your economic structures and logic because we already know how it works. And we have to basically destroy it, or at least consign it to just one subsection of everyday life. It cannot be the most important thing. If we cannot express thoughts to ourselves through the language of capitalist economics, we can't use words like moving forward or accountability or analysis of efficiencies, which are related to the extraction of surplus value. The more efficient you are at the process of exploitation, obviously, the more profitable you'll be because of your wage theft on the basic level. Or you'll be able to identify the more innovative workers that you will overexploit and reward them with great income at the expense of the dead weight, sort of poorly functioning workers who don't produce a lot of value, but you can't kill them because that's also kind of inefficient. So you just have to pay them a wage. So that's the basic thinking of people like Becker, for example, the great kind of liberal economist from the University of Chicago that Foucault studied, who basically said that today capitalists hire people not because they want to in general, but because they kind of have to. Most workers don't add value to the value process. They have to identify the select few who are innovative and change the labor process, which is then owned by the capitalists, and that's the startup culture, the incubators, where you sort out them, but that's a side. So, so then what is modern politics, right? So what is the politics out of which Marxism came and out of liberalism came? And very briefly, you know, we can say that modern subjectivity, which grounds the political, which is the political, is established through something that we can call, to use the words of one of his teachers at the New School, the German thinker, Rainer Schumann, who was quoting Heidegger here, because Heidegger was really smart, you know, even though he wasn't a Marxist. So Heidegger said that modern subjectivity, since the European Enlightenment, is formed through the recursive relations to oneself, and the oneself is interpreted as the I, right? So I, you know. So what does that mean? That a better way of understanding that, perhaps, or a more immediate way of understanding. So Heidegger said, what the Enlightenment sort of uncovered and what Marx believed in as the basis for communist politics is that what makes a human being is that a human being participates, organizes life, and makes sense of their life through social relations that return to, near, and for oneself. So if you think about representative politics, which is one expression of Enlightenment sort of thinking about the self, politics near the self, so the division between the private and the public, like Kant articulated, right? That's one expression of how, or Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, right? So in other words, I exchange my fundamental political rights to the government, to the state, which is a condition of loss, but I gain something else, but whatever I give up is near me. I maintain some kind of a connection, direct connection, if you will, even though it's indirectly expressed through the representative process, to this thing called the state, which is really me, but it's near me. But I understand that I can get rid of it at any time. So that's Rousseau, that's Thomas Jefferson, who said that periodically the American people should kill Congress and replace it with other people if they drift too far away.
I like the way our friend takes the language and puts it into a very violent verb.
A little bit modified.
Watering the tree of liberty.
Yeah, you have to water the tree of liberty with the martyrs and enemies. I mean, Jefferson was extraordinary.
But he didn't mean just change the people in Congress. He meant that each generation has to decide
and
how to live.
Is it working?
How to organize politics.
So in that sense, Marx is a child of this idea. He would accept this and of course express it in a clearer way, in a more radical way, in the sense that he says, yes, we don't even ultimately need the recursive relations to ourselves to be near ourselves. You know, we are the relationship. So in that sense, it's a return to Aristotle in that sense. But another way you can think about this, the basics of modern politics and what it means, if we truly uncover the energies in Marx's ideas, you can think about it through a quote that the French philosopher Deleuze said when he paraphrased the beginning of modern politics. He said, you know, what happened in the time of Leibniz and Newton, these people were very interesting because they laid the basis of modern science as well. So Deleuze said, this is when a new politics emerged of the human being coming into a relationship with itself. So in other words, there's no need to refer to some external source of explaining who you are and why you do things and how to make sense of it, like a god, or like a queen, or like some kind of an external source of mythology. No, you just have to use your own ability to live life and to act in this world, to think, to make sense of things, and to act. And that's what essentially the basis of Marx's ideas of a fully developed human being. Somebody who's capable of acting, of thinking, of using all of your apparatuses for making sense of the world in action. And if you're prevented from doing so, there's got to be a good reason that you can make sense of and agree to. Otherwise, it's unjustifiable, right? So in that sense, modern politics is this kind of, coming from the Enlightenment, is this very positive and very inspiring story of affirming the self in the collective, right? And sort of, it calls for developing our ability to think, to make sense of the world. So in other words, it's geared towards living a life that's meaningful rather than meaningless. Right? So we can talk about it in this way. Like what percentage of how people feel at the end of the workday? Well, we teach at BMCC at the Financial District in Tribeca, and if you just see how people leave their offices at 5 p.m., their body language, they're running down their steps on the subway. They can kill themselves, tripping and falling down. They're like, I need to get out, because I just wasted my life for 8 hours. I need to get out. So it's the generalized meaninglessness that defines capitalist life. So in other words, how do we recapture the political as the center of our life? This is sort of, I think, the Marxist and the Communist project, actually. How do we consign the economic to a position of subservience to the political? How do we jail it, and contain it in a way that it only does what's necessary, which is just to organize the most basic things in human life. How do I get my shelter? Where do I get my food from? These are things that are not necessary, but on our level of economic development, should not be a big deal. Like to have clean water is not a big deal in the 21st century. It shouldn't be, right? But it is. So just 5 more minutes because I won't be able to outline because
We're going to do it next year.
We're going to do it next year. But I think what's happening now is something very dangerous. And now I think what's happening is that the political is jailed successfully, and it's become functioning identical to the rules and the internal logic of the capitalist economy. So what does that mean? That means that let's see, what should I say? That means we have to ask ourselves, what is the internal logic of the way the economic is organized today? And today the economic is organized through the concept of the digital, right? And what is the digital? The digital is essentially a new metaphysics. The digital is essentially the elevation of formal mathematical logic, which is one type of the mathematical. It's one type of mathematics that is very useful in the modern capitalist economy because of reasons of efficiency and innovation. Capitalism is also innovative in its own way. It's not just obsessed with efficiency. But formal mathematical logic, which first expressed itself fully in cybernetics, computing devices that can compute any general task, right after World War II, which then became used, left the military, the labs of the military industrial complex, where it was used for radar design and so on and so forth, and then became absorbed by the large corporations. And as the corporations, as the capitalist economy started using formal mathematical logic expressed in general and network computer machinery, that changed the functioning of the economy, and thus it changed automatically social relations. So formal mathematical logic became socialized, which is something that it's not supposed to be. Right? It was not supposed to function that way. It was supposed to be just a tool that engaged in the waging of war, which then expanded into a tool on how to make decisions on how to make commodities for exchange. And then it became today the logic through which you make sense of everything in the world, including the political. So that's a new thing, right? So the replacement of political ideas, like I have rights, if you're a liberal, which are defined as, the public versus the private. And, Marxists would say that's a myth, don't believe that stuff, it doesn't work like that. And then we propose our own political ideas, the concepts of oppression, of racism, of power, of alienation, of the not fully formed, the crippled human life, and all of these things are now more and more meaningless, right? And this for the statistically average person, right, in the modern world. And now they're replaced with the logic of the social formalized, the mathematical logic of cybernetics as it's implemented in computer technologies, right? That doesn't make sense on many levels. Why it makes sense of why talk to your friends through the language of cybernetics? So at base we have a meaninglessness that emerges in conversation where you have a mismatch of, it's an ideological problem too, which doesn't mean that it's not functioning very well, but anyways. So I think that's the main problem that's happening. So we have the introduction of digital social objects. I think this is something that it's helpful to understand what it means. So when the explanation and the description of what algorithms are, the way they're implemented in computer software and hardware, when that becomes the explanation of what a human being is and what social relations are, in other words, this kind of logic becomes formalized, socialized, it becomes a way through which it affects social relations. So people start actually acting and thinking, and sort of reacting in ways in response to these kinds of speech patterns. So this is the change of language also that's becoming apolitical. So we have to make sense of this thing called digital social object. I'm not calling it a citizen, I'm not calling it a person. So in other words, human beings as the basic political category, whether you want to call it a citizen, a working class person, a bourgeois, these things in some ways are meaningless if you read some of the theoretical utterings of some of these cutting-edge capitalists, like Ed Thiel, what's his name, the crazy guy who runs, who came from PayPal. Peter Thiel. He does not talk about people. He talks about sort of data objects. So we have a transition. We have, in other words, the French Revolution introduced the concept of the citizen and not the subject, right? So it's somebody who, unlike the subject of the king, has certain autonomy in certain degrees. And then Marxists and revolutionary politics anarchists too came with the notion of the new Soviet person or the new Cuban person, or in Venezuela, there was this narrative too, and so the attempt to change society by changing subjectivity. Now the capitalists are changing subjectivity too, and they're saying, okay, we don't need all this negative, all this old baggage of the imprecise, vague, philosophical, political concepts of John Locke and whatever. Digital social objects. We have big data that's generalized, right? So what comes out of this, just to finish, what comes out of this, I think, are the beginning outlines of not Homo economicus, a person who is reduced to just consumption of commodified goods. We have the human being reduced to usage of things. So it's not even a consumption anymore. You're not a consumer, you're just a user of pre-made things that others made, who are in a position of power, of course, but their relationship to you is mediated through this new type of a mediation. You can call it a new type of alienated existence, because you always have alienation, but it's a new type of alienated existence, the alienated existence of the socialized mathematical logic and its structures, and which also condition the movement. So instead of human beings, instead of citizens, instead of consuming beings, economic beings, instead of docile bodies like Foucault wrote about, instead of sort of passive people who just obey the rules and act accordingly in order to avoid pain or punishment, instead of a person who is motivated by libidinal energies, right? So and acts as a way, lives by consuming things that are targeting their libido, for example. You simply have a person who doesn't do any of that stuff. Doesn't process information even on that level, but simply uses things, pushes buttons on a cell phone, green or red, infantilization, right? The magical almost reduction of human beings into children, earlier levels of human development.
There is a next step to using and consuming. The Thai called it consummation, which is using and wasting.
Or ritual suicide, I guess.
It's wastefulness.
Wastefulness, yeah. Or waste, which introduces the politics of genocide.
That was his word, consummation.
Yeah. So in other words,
libido built in.
Yes. So in other words, so homo datum has to be something I think that's useful to illustrate along the models offered by Marx, homo faber, that Marx used, the creative human, the creature that is part of matter but can shape matter according to their own will and reason. This can be a horrible thing, but this can also be something that's very liberating in a way.
That presupposes Marx, the father of modern anthropology,
Vico, right.
He was the first to really talk about homo faber.
Homo faber, and Marx kind of used that tradition. And then you go through all these other levels of the docile life to reach homo datum, which I think is a radical intensification of the most oppressive sides of capitalist society. Why? Because it fully reduces human. This is the new proletariat, by the way. You can also say, like, what is the new proletariat? It's the average member of society, let's say 20 years from now, if we continue down this trajectory, who is simply reduced to a condition of simple using of digital social objects. And this sets up new relationships. Homo datum versus homo datum. Homo datum versus some other digital social object that's not human. Humans interacting with software. Like now you can already call Verizon Healthcare, Verizon customer support.
Well, they'll get into it.
Right, if you're talking to a human or if you're talking to an artificial intelligence agent, right? And you also have digital social object to digital social object relation. So the entire apparatus of Marxist explanations for how the capitalist worker interaction, class interaction, but also how the circuits of capital function is subject to amendment. Because now you have the introduction of a new type of value extraction, new definition of what does it mean to be a human being, meaning the absence of that thing and its generalization into something that's digital. And lastly, how can a homo datum make sense of the world? Not by doing what Deleuze said, but by constantly referring to this new external source of truth, which is always going to be, in this case, datum. Datum is the sort of the originary, the algorithm. Mathematics doesn't lie and has no emotions. This is like the slogan of millions of programmers. Math doesn't lie and has no emotions and this is objective.
Well, it's a slogan that goes back 500 years.
It does, except now, except now it's implemented in a way that's more fully and more radically present. So, and then of course these ideas of social structures like at work. What are labor structures at work, structures of exploitation? We can call them provisionally, for example, machinic structures, using Deleuze and Guattari, but in a new way perhaps, machinic structures, they're basically radicalized structures of exploitation, dehumanization, geared towards simple usage of pre-made objects. Objects can be intellectual objects, physical objects, any kind of objects that we actually interact with. So we're facing a challenge, building on top of all the things that Michael Peter said, but also a radical oversimplification of life for most people in a society like ours. And then I just want to end by saying that this opens terrifying propositions. For example, the new policies of race. You can really do racism for real now, not a pseudoscience, when you start having improved humans versus unimproved humans. Those with implants, those with not, those with pre-genetic, genetic modifications before birth and after, which have some noticeable, noticeably expressed features in everyday life, right? So you run faster, you feel pain less, you can memorize things more. I'm not saying that's qualitatively would be an advantage, but it could be, right? So now we face the resetting of racism. So all this history of anti-racist politics, and now it can be easily reset when you introduce homo datum as the new basic unit of the new citizen. Right? You can also have horrible extensions into cyborg sort of life forms, cloning and all these things. So in other words, capitalism may continue in its next stage, in the post-enlightenment stage, of kind of a new stage of radical politics that will make
the post-human.
The post-human really is a truly terrifying, for me, is a truly terrifying politics, which may make the Nazi project look like child's. So I think this is where I'm sort of going. Right?
I think Arto and Peter both open up something for another thinker that we really didn't bring into today. Someone who was never really considered a quote Marxist to the letter, Bernard Stiegler, who says the new definition of the proletariat is those who do not make anything. right? He was really looking at, and if you don't know how to make, you don't know how to live, which Peter says, you have the appliances, you're able to consume, but you can't live with it because you're working too much or you're too exhausted. We have to learn how to sleep again, a very natural bodily function, etc. So Stiegler has a very interesting new notion of the proletariat that I think is much more connected to what Arto was presenting in terms of this algorithm of needs, the algorithm that determines a good part of everyday life, you know, the algorithmos, right? What is, you know, to go to Henri Lefebvre, the rhythm analysis of everyday life is something that we really haven't taken up in an active way that would be part of the prosperity Marxism project and how one may overcome, you know, in a sense, through a rhythm analysis of everyday life, overcome these tendencies that we speak about as an anecdote. Well, why don't we open it up to the floor? Yeah, Phil, yeah, I'll start with you.
Just, it's interesting that the new definition.
Yeah, really? Okay.
The new definition of truth is
surplus.
The new definition of truth is data-driven.
Right.
Yes.
If something's data-driven, it's true.
And what is data? Data is pre-formed. It's already, in other words, it's already by the time data exists as such, it's already been written in the database or it's been accepted as, and I just want to read this one sentence from Hegel, who warned on the dangers of data, essentially. Thinking of data as logic. And Hegel said, the phenomenology of the mind, he said, a set scientific truth, recorded in verbal terminology and divorced from the route by which it was acquired, turns into a verbal husk even as it returns all external signs of the truth. And then the dead seizes hold of the living and does not allow it to go forward along the road of science, along the road of truth. Dead truth becomes the energy of living, developing truth. This is how we get the dogmatic and ossified intellect, what the graduation examinations, he's talking about the students and some of these things, is awarded a 5, but whom life gives a 2 or even lower. You know, failure.
It was a radical at this point. Yes. Yeah. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. You can talk about the data-driven equilibrium analysis in economics that led to 2008. Because everything outside of that was considered an externality. It didn't fit into the mathematical data-driven logic. And the same thing, you know, you can, if you apply that to the automated machinery and such, there may be some externalities in relation to that. That's called human beings. And that could lead to the same sort of near catastrophe that happened in 2008. So yeah, but I still think that an analysis of a transition is necessary. Going from the real austerity that does exist, that people do want to fight against, to some larger vision. Somehow, I'm very skeptical of the event. Some sort of like leap that hasn't been thought through. And so I know I agree with things that you've said because they've been very good. But I think that one has to be clear. One still has a rational program as far as you can do it.
You know, it's interesting if I may respond to this. I mean, it's amazing that mainstream neoclassical economics, bourgeois economics, which approached the study of the economy as data, so they already had all the answers. There was the modeling which accounted for everything. Even though they were confronted with how their models failed completely, it didn't cause a ripple. It continued as if nothing happened. Right? This is the absence of thinking that is pathological, that has become so divorced from the basic, even treatments of basic classical liberal expectations like Locke and so on and so forth, of what it means to be a human being in the modern sense of the word. The other thing is the question of the leap. You know, there's a renaissance now of Soviet philosophy because for a long time in the West it was assumed that the Soviet Union did not produce any significant philosophers of Marxism. And the worst people who are guilty of this were the Western Marxists, who dismissed Soviet thinkers without knowing any of them, because they couldn't read Russian, because it wasn't one of the major languages, as if nothing. So one of the major Soviet philosophers...
Including Marcuse, which was unfortunate.
Right. So one of the major Soviet philosophers was Ilenkov, who died in '79. And Ilenkov was asked by a Western Marxist in 1971, well, how do we get the communist relations? Like Marx didn't say what communism is, and we know that we're gonna have to invent it, but how do we get there? And Ilenkov, in a kind of slightly kind of annoyed and vulgar way, he said the first step is you have to destroy capitalist private property. You just have to do that. And then after that, when you institute formal socialization of property relations, formal, which means you still have the inertia of the capitalist thinking, ideology, acculturalization. People still go to work in the factories. People say, Stanley, Stanley would say, like, the Soviets had exploitation of labor in their factories. Of course they did. Because you can't, it's not like a machine. You can't be like, yesterday you were a factory worker, today the factory is yours, so you're a free human being. No, you're going to go to work. You're going to expect to have a manager. So in other words, this takes centuries, or maybe many decades, to change human subjectivities from one mode of existence to another. So the first step is you got to get rid of capitalist forms of private capital. And it's amazing that in many cases in Western Marxist thinking, that's considered like an overwhelming intellectual thing of the imaginary. What do you mean? That's going to be violent? Of course it's going to be violent. Part of the reason why the Venezuelans are still in power, even though we can say Venezuela, are they really Marxist? I don't want to get into that. I personally support that project 100% because it's anti, the West. One thing they learned is that they have 500,000 armed militia that's patrolling the street. In other words, they're taking this first step, right, which encroaches on the political and economic forms of power on which the capitalist class resides and rests its power. So,
yeah, Chris, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make a suggestion to any of you who found the discussion of the tie interesting. There will be a panel following this panel on the tie, the cursed share, on the collapse of capitalism, an interesting look at the singularity, ontology, and the tie.
Yes,
Cursed austerity.
Our cursed austerity is the title of the panel, also sponsored by us.
Yes,
And Chris will
sponsored
be
by us.
moderating.
I'm the moderator.
Some other thoughts, questions, criticisms, etc. Again, we're just trying to lay out a sketch. I just wanted to go back one minute. When Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of his book was entitled "The Human Use of Human Beings," right? In a sense. It was instrumental language, obviously, in a sense, but it was not the use of human beings, for profit. It was the human use of human beings. And Wiener himself, in the Cybernetic Project post-World War II, thought of this as a humanistic project. This was part of a whole model that included neo-Freudian psychoanalysis, many military and industrial applications. But for Wiener, it was really to actually free humanity, not to make it part of the war machine. Although, as we all know, he went directly there. And Wiener was at MIT for all those years. So, but anyway, he's one of the founding, fathers. Yes.
Yes. Well, I was thinking about two questions interrelated with this question of prosperity Marxism. Two of the challenges that any potential socialist project will face today is one that the delinking from globalization, which in a certain way means a reduction in, at least nominal terms, in
less is more.
In economic activity, in trade, and things like that. Otherwise, we are too much exposed to economic pressures. And two, ecology. The other restraint
we didn't really mention except the sun.
So what I find very interesting about going back into all this conception of the full development, etc., from the Marxist tradition is exactly that it offers a way to present what, in technical terms, is big growth as something that is, in fact, is a much richer kind of sociality, and it is a way to actually address the people, because, it's the only way to, instead of having a rather religious conception of you have to go through hardship in order to reach a better society, it is a way to say that even within what technically would be hardship, it's not going to be that hardship, it's going to be much more creative and open experience, and it is obvious that we really need to, from the beginning, experiment with new forms of richer sociality. This is indispensable in any socialist policy, because you can initially rely on some sort of heroism. There is always a heroic element in mass movements, even a conception of martyrdom. You've seen this, for example, in resistance during World War II. But then that people can't go through that for a very long time. There's a limit. There's a limit to that. So afterwards, either you go into some kind of Marxist Protestant ethic that you always work.
Well, the martyr becomes a hero, and the hero becomes a legend, and then the legend doesn't hold.
Yeah, but also but afterwards, either you go into some kind of Marxist Protestantism that life is austere in the end, but there's always a golden grace, or you sort of suggest that struggle can be enriching in a certain way, or can be a better part of the society. So that's what I find very interesting.
Thank you. Anybody else? We have 3, 4, 5 minutes. Whatever. Yeah. Any suggestions for prosperity?
If you're having trouble sleeping, there are a number of terrific sound apps out there.
I heard tapping's the new thing. You tap to sleep. Yeah, that's a new thing that you tap.
Tap.
Yeah, tap. Yeah. One of my cousins uses. That's how I learned about this stuff. With my bourgeois connections. We tap to go to sleep. Tapping. Pills are easier. Body tapping.
But I think in a certain sense, I think what it always is, or it means for me at least, when we talk about this a lot, is that an important part of politics today, and for us on the left, is obviously these battle of ideas. Not just ideas, but obviously to always be plugged into some kind of action, but the action is also the thinking, the confronting the ideas that order our world.
This was
in a new way, in a way that responds to the exact configuration of what happens today.
To me, this was one of the great, contributions that Althusser saw philosophy as a place of class struggle in theory. This was really something that was never really taken seriously, certainly by the American philosophical community, and very, somewhat in Europe, but not as much as it should have been, and also, the struggle among ideas. This has been censored.
I mean, here's
we got people that have silencing points in almost every institutional struggle. You look at the labor unions today, any militancy is silenced by the hierarchies.
And in part what you're saying, when you mentioned Tina in your comments, in part what we're saying is that politics no longer exists in contemporary society. It's no longer a question of some political process through which we posit what we think the good society is, which we posit how we think is the good way to live. All that is already foreclosed. It's already, and the political machinery is simply about administering the various elements of the marketplace.
It's almost a form of suicide.
And we wrote, Stanley and myself, Rick Wolff wrote a manifesto for the left turn in 2008. And the best critique we got, Peter wrote a critique on Aristotelian, from an Aristotelian Marxism point of view. But anyway, we got a great critique from a friend of ours who's now deceased, Jeff Lustig, who was on the West Coast, who said, what are you selling? What do you have to offer the next generation? You have this manifesto, but what ultimately are you really putting out there? What are you offering, as Peter just said, in terms of the good life or the transformed life, etc.? This is something we do have to think through. And I like what Paniot, make struggle meaningful, make struggle.
There has to be an alternative understanding of the good. Beyond, there are 20 different kinds of toilet paper to choose from.
Exactly.
One
is rougher than the other.
It's interesting. Yesterday, I got a book from the publishers. The publishers send us books at the college to adopt, so they give you these free copies, which of course we sell immediately. Because we're also contaminated.
You mean those guys come around?
Yeah. There's a flat earther.
They've got the little thing that stands in. Is this a first edition? This how to use?
But in the new textbook on American government from Pearson Publishing, there was an insert from the publishers of why I should choose this book for the class, and it said something like, data-driven psychology research outlines the new college student. And there are bullet points in there, and it said something like 80%, it is assumed that, based on these studies, that 80% of the typical college student in the average classroom, because of the world that they live in and because of technology and everything, cannot read, it just says it straight up, they cannot read long texts. So they already accept this. This is already part of the education process, the training of teachers, or teachers are trained this way. And it says because of social media, students know how to communicate effectively through short bursts of text on Instagram and Twitter. So we have changed the textbook to accommodate short bursts of, so that already is a fundamental change in human life.
I mean, they already have a category, the attention economy.
You don't need to read. You have to, there's other ways to take information. Video, short bursts of text, you cannot, which means automatically you cannot understand complex arguments. Whether it's a novel or whatever, you just can't do it. And if you believe that and you act accordingly, this becomes an actual social effect of actually running a curriculum that teaches students according to what their strengths are, which is it's the new generation. You know, it's old to read books. The new thing is you have to do things in very short readings, 1 to 2 pages, 3 pages.
That suggests that IQ isn't complex.
They didn't say anything about that.
Good. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Mark, it seems to me the vision is Fahrenheit 451.
Great.
And it may have more truth than
we originally thought. We just thought it was science fiction.
Yeah, but you don't require any force. We're doing it to ourselves.
Right.